was Attorney General in the coalition and chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee from 2015 to 2019. Dominic obviously ran as an independent Conservative at the last election and was key in scrutinising the government's approach to Brexit. So we'll let Dominic speak for a bit and then message me and Sam any questions, and we will ask them to him. So take it away. Oh, he might be frozen. That was anticlimactic.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry about that start, not what I had intended. And it may be that we're going to get a further problem on this because we seem to have a problem locally with the internet, and at about 5 p.m. by overload, it sometimes trips out and then it comes back again. If that happens, do not despair. We will extend it insofar as those of you are willing to do it, and I will make sure that you get your hour's worth from me. I'm delighted to be able to address the Cambridge University Liberal Association. I should explain, it's only the second time in my life I think I've ever addressed the Liberal Association. The first time I did it was when I went to address the AGM of the association in my own constituency, after they had very kindly said they wouldn't put a candidate up against me in the general election last December. And I think you are therefore only the second occasion when I have had the pleasure of doing this. But of course, as we saw last year, the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives were brought together by a whole series of events, which at least some Conservatives were brought together with Liberal Democrats in relation to Brexit. So what I thought I'd do this afternoon is just say a few words about Brexit first, and then I would, hang on, can you just hold on a second? Hugo, can you ring your mother, not me, because I'm doing a webinar. Sorry, that's my son ringing from Kabul in Afghanistan, which is a bit complicated. He's in the army. Very strange events taking place. Right, back to where we started. I just wanted to look back over what had happened over the last 3 years, because I think unless we do, we're not going to see how things are likely to pan out in relation to Brexit over the coming years. Brexit, as you all know, is an event carried out in the name of tradition. At least that's what most of my Leaver Conservative colleagues seem to think. It was restoring some status quo ante, which was of great importance to a large number of people. But the real problem is that Brexit was in fact a revolutionary act. And revolutions have a tendency to have a momentum all of their own and to be in practice largely unstoppable, even by the people who think they want to bring the process to an end. And that's exactly what we've seen happen in this particular case. No sooner was Brexit decided upon through the referendum that firstly, Cameron's government fell. Secondly, the Conservative Party came together to try to introduce some degree of rationality in putting Theresa May into Downing Street, only to discover that Theresa May was in fact unable to deliver a Brexit that satisfied anybody. She wasn't able to satisfy, obviously, people like yourselves, because you'd have much rather stayed in the EU. And quite bluntly, she couldn't satisfy me, because the deal which she eventually did was in many ways a very poor one. It was a third-rate future relationship. On the other end of the spectrum, I have my ERG colleagues or ex-colleagues in Parliament who took the view that it was a complete sellout because it didn't achieve their ends. And I think the harsh reality of Brexit has always been that it does have a real binary quality about it. Because if you think it's a bad idea, then no amount of halfway houses are ever going to look particularly good. And if you think it's a good idea, then the halfway houses are dreadful because they actually call into question why on earth we're going. Ultimately, in order to exist, and I think prosper economically, the United Kingdom has to have a close economic partnership with our closest trading partners. And those, despite the role of the United States, which remains, I accept, quite considerable, are mostly located in Europe. Ireland, Belgium, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, Spain are really key trading partners of the UK. No amount of free trade agreements with Australia or New Zealand or even Canada are going to be a substitute for those, and a trade deal with the United States looks frankly inherently improbable because of the protectionism of Donald Trump. So we find ourselves in a situation 3 years down the track, where in fact what we have succeeded in 4 years down the track, we've succeeded in doing to ourselves is pushing ourselves into a corner. And the response of the public has ultimately been that they prefer to trust Boris Johnson, because that's what this last election was all about, because the alternative, and the only alternative available was a Corbyn government, looked significantly worse. My own impression in my own constituency is that people were not particularly enthusiastic about the prospect of a Boris Johnson government. But after all, if you've embarked on a course of action where reasonable people can't find a solution, then what tends to happen is that you go for the person who is both optimistic and reckless and says that he can deliver it. And you will go for that, particularly if you think the alternative is in fact a government which is incapable of leading the country under any circumstances. And that's where Jeremy Corbyn was. Last autumn, I hoped that we might succeed through parliamentary pressure in getting a second referendum. And I'm afraid I failed in that. I regret politely having to say that I think that the Liberal Democrats made an error, although Joe Swinson remains a very good friend, in deciding in late October, early November, that an election was inevitable and it would be advantageous to go for it. By the time I think that she'd realised that it might not be, Jeremy Corbyn had leapt on that bandwagon, and I'm afraid the rest is history. It was always absolutely clear to me that if we had an election in the autumn, the chances of getting a hung parliament and not getting a Conservative majority government were exceptionally slim. So we are where we are, and the revolutionary bandwagon rolls on, which is one of the really big problems that we've got. So we have to decide, I think, for those of us who are, I suppose, ex-Remainers or Ramoners, or however you want to describe it, what we can best do next. Now, as some of you will know, I'm a member of the Council of the European Movement, and I'm also, rather surprisingly, the chairman of the Conservative Group for Europe, which you may be even more surprised to hear has 3 times the number of members that it had 2 years ago. So you're not on your own in thinking that leaving the European Union is a bad idea. But realistically, the coming year looks to me to be very difficult to see how we are going to influence the outcome of these negotiations. Boris Johnson, who is a man who is absolutely intent, his main focus is his own popularity. So he may well be deeply troubled by the hole which he has been digging for himself, and which is now made even deeper by COVID-19. But getting himself out of that hole and doing what I suppose many of you would think is the sensible course of action, which is to ask for a 1-year transition extension and to try and get some reasonable deal with the EU, is something which I think he will be very unwilling to do. If he were to do it, it would mean reneging on a promise to a section of the Conservative Party, reneging on a promise to a section of the electorate who are not necessarily particularly sophisticated, but to whom he promised that we would be gone by the end of the year. And he will get a huge dollop of hostility from newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph. And I think it would be very difficult for him to simply say, well, circumstance and COVID have forced me to do this. We need the extra 12 months. And if we don't have that extra 12 months, then I'm sorry to be pessimistic, but I think the chances of his getting a deal with our European Union partners is very low. Talking to them, and I have still, I think, good contacts at EU level and also in some of our foreign partner countries, strikes me that they are increasingly pessimistic because ultimately we are simply not talking the same language. They, running a multinational organization, underpinned treaty organisation underpinned by a complicated rule book are principally concerned with trying to maintain a level playing field. And the United Kingdom seems absolutely intent on wanting to trade without a level playing field, because unless Boris Johnson can make that work, then actually justifying Brexit in the longer term becomes impossible. So I think there will be significant difficulties. There are even going to be difficulties over doing things like justice and security, which one might think didn't have any particular economic content. And that's because even when you move to that, there's still issues about the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, certainly over data protection. And even if you step outside of data protection, he seems intent on refusing to give an assurance that we would even be adherent to all the norms of the European Convention on Human Rights. Although I should add, having originally left government in 2014 because of my defence of the European Convention on Human Rights, is I don't think this government is about to take us out of the Council of Europe and the European Convention, even if there's a lot of huffing and puffing on the sidelines. But that's the consequence that flows from becoming ideologically committed and starting to become blinkered and withdrawing from what I would describe as ordinary UK pragmatism, which has on the whole characterised both of the two main political parties and indeed the Liberal Democrats to a great extent, certainly when they joined us in government when we were in coalition. I don't know how the year is going to pan out. I have no idea how the current COVID crisis is going to end. I'm still in lockdown, you all are. Your term at Cambridge has been completely scuppered. I'm very sorry for all of you who have got exams to take, and it all looks extremely difficult. It is going to be, however, I think, a deepening crisis when it comes to the summer, and indeed the crisis is likely to crystallise in as little as 4 to 5 weeks' time. So, what can we do? Well, I think ultimately, my view has always been that the best thing for those of us who think that close relations with the European Union are important is that we should be constantly sending out a message to our European partners and indeed partner organisations that there are lots of people here who think that Britain's ultimate destiny will be with our European partners, possibly back in the EU, possibly it may be a different form of EU by the time we rejoin it. But I think we have to look long term. And we also have to wait until the public mood changes. As we're celebrating VE Day, I think it was Churchill who memorably said when he took over from the Attlee government in the early 1950s, and somebody said, "Are you going to reverse everything that Attlee's done?" And he said, "No, it has to run its course." And I think we have to accept that as well. Now, for you yourselves as Liberal Democrats, you have lots of other challenges. You've got a new leadership election coming up, a question of how you maximise your clout at Westminster, which is very difficult for you, and also how you do it at a local government level. But what I'd like to assure you is that there are plenty of moderate people who still think that there is a good and reasonable way of cooperating together over this issue. And I suspect the European movement, in terms of bringing people together from all political parties, will become increasingly important in doing that. Now, I'm conscious that speaking on Zoom, so thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to the discussion and to hearing your views and feeding in my own. Thank you very much for asking me along today.
Thank you very much. I want to.
You muted yourself, Freddie.
Yeah. I want to start actually not on Brexit, unusually, and going to talk about your work as the chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee. And I was wondering if you could talk about, first our relationship with China after COVID, but also around all the things that we heard in the news before COVID, around Huawei and such. And secondly, how the government handles its relationship with Cobra and Sage and the security implications. How do you do sort of these security and scientific meetings whilst also keeping transparent and accountable government?
Two very big topics. I will try and give you a sketch. I was chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee from 2015 until last November, with some interruptions because of the elections that took place in that time. The election in, the election in 2017 interrupted us very badly, actually for nearly 6 months, which was a very unsatisfactory state of affairs. And after 2015, we weren't set up until about 6 months after the election had taken place. It's one of the last committees to be set up. I'll come back to that issue in a moment. This, as you know, is a cross-party committee. Under my chairmanship, we had 9 members, no Liberal Democrat represented on it, but we had 4 Conservatives, 3 Labour, 1 SNP, because they're now the third party, and 1 crossbench peer. But quite frankly, if you'd come into any of our meetings and sat in on them, which is what you can't do because they take place in secret, you wouldn't be able to tell who is from which political party. And that is as it has always been. It's a highly professional committee. It's there to superintend the work of the intelligence services, that's GCHQ, MI6, MI5, and more recently, it's taken on the superintendence of defence intelligence, and also the Central Secretariat in Whitehall that does the collation and analysis of intelligence material to prepare it for the Prime Minister or for senior ministers or for the National Security Council. We can request information on any topic we like. We don't necessarily have to be carrying out an inquiry in order to do that, but we also carry out themed inquiries, which are obviously a bit limited by time. And over the course of my chairmanship, we had a number of inquiries, partly into terrorism-related matters, partly into the into legislation, and partly we did a big inquiry into Russia. And in fact, I think this is less well understood, but we were in the middle of, or I suppose, a third of the way in, a quarter of the way into an inquiry into China as a threat to the United Kingdom when we had to draw stumps back in November. And of course, at the time when we ceased to operate, our Russia report was awaiting publication imminently, having been fully redacted, fully worked through with the intelligence services. What we do, just so people should understand, is that when we prepare a report, we prepare the report and it's then submitted to the intelligence services, and they identify those things which can't be put into the public domain. So we then produce a closed report and an open report. And the open report is a subject of dialogue. So there's a sort of ping pong that takes place between us and the services and the Central Intelligence Secretariat about what can and can't go in it. And in the case of the Russia report, we had completed that process and we had sent it to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, on the 18th of October, in the knowledge that an election might be coming up, in the desire that we should get that report out before the election took place, and in the knowledge that the agreed turnaround time by the Prime Minister's office for the Prime Minister to sign it off is 10 days. He failed to get back to us in the 10 days. He failed to provide any explanation. And when finally he did provide an explanation through his press office, it was completely bogus. It was suggesting that further redactions might be required, and it normally took 6 weeks. All this is complete and total nonsense, which reflects badly on the Prime Minister and the way he was operating. I can't speculate on why he wouldn't allow us to publish the Russia report. As I've said on a number of occasions, the Russia report this is a very sensible committee. The Russia report is not going to be full of polemic, and nor does it contain some extraordinary smoking gun. But until it comes out and people can see what's in it, I'm afraid I can't comment on it beyond that. Now, China. China is probably a much bigger long-term threat to the United Kingdom than is Russia. The only difference is that its geographical distance means that some of the problems that China is causing are less marked than Russia's, and it is less of a maverick state than Russia is. Russia's unpredictability is what makes it dangerous. Otherwise, in many ways, it's a failing state, which is above all failing economically. China is entirely different. It's a rising power. And it's a power that claims that it wishes to be a participant in the international rules-based system, and indeed wishes to cooperate with other states. But the way it interprets the international rules-based system is significantly different from the West. And China's attitude is that the West has set these rules and it will mold those rules and influence them to its own convenience. And on top of that, as you can see for yourselves, under the current presidency of Xi Jinping, it's abundantly clear that muscle flexing and saber rattling have become pretty clear parts of Chinese strategy, which is unusual because I think it was Deng Xiaoping who said that China should proceed very slowly and give the impression, and it would achieve its aims, in a sense, by stealth. The consequence of that is that increasingly the countries in the Pacific periphery of China are very worried about China's activities, whether it's its attempt to lay hold of the South China Sea, its attitude to Taiwan, or indeed the way in which it carries out its diplomacy and global influencing campaigns, whether it's to access raw materials in Africa or in its relationship, for example, with Australia. And I'll come back to that in a moment in the Huawei context. At the same time, China is clearly a very important trading partner for the United Kingdom. Now, the difficulty is, how do you deal with this? Where do you draw the red lines? And how do you protect yourself against China's predatory activities? And also bearing in mind that China it's certainly an authoritarian state, but I think in addition to that, whereas people thought 10, 15 years ago that it was an authoritarian state which might be relaxing its authoritarianism, the evidence today is that China is turning into a totalitarian state. The behavior towards Uyghurs in Xinjiang is absolutely clear as to the enormity of what they're doing. And they're also creating an Orwellian surveillance state of a kind that mercifully we in the West don't have. And that then brings me to Huawei, where we produced a report early about Huawei as part of our China inquiry. There are two distinct issues over Huawei. Huawei is the main provider of technology for 5G and will be. There are at the moment, apart from Nokia and Ericsson, no other companies, and the Cisco in the United States, which does some parts, there are no other companies which are capable of rolling out a 5G program, and Huawei is much bigger than the others and has much more resources to do it. Oddly enough, Huawei's engineering is pretty sloppy. Well, the curiosities that emerged from this inquiry was actually to discover just how sloppy it could be. That probably is the consequence of dealing with something which is approaching being a volume provider. The UK government took a decision some time ago that Huawei could be in our telecommunications. And I'm satisfied from the work I did on the committee that our national security is not being compromised by using Huawei parts. That is because in our own intelligence services, and particularly the National Cybersecurity Centre, we have centres of excellence which can pick up pretty well if somebody is trying to manufacture backdoors into our own internet and telecommunications systems. And there is a dedicated centre that we forced Huawei to set up and indeed to finance so that Huawei's parts can be vetted. So the general view is that if we were to ask Huawei to contribute to making our 5G, I think that the risk of our systems being subverted so that in some way they could switch off our nuclear power stations, or worst of all, turn them critical, or turn off our electricity, or interfere with our telecommunications, is not present, because I think we have the means and resources both to protect ourselves from that and to identify if they're doing it. But that still leaves a much bigger issue, which I suppose could be described as a geostrategic issue, which is, do you want a company which is in fact the arm of a totalitarian state to be the growing monopoly provider of internet and telecommunication services in your country? And what does that dependency mean in the long term? And are you comfortably, even morally, with that dependency when they are also the principal agents of the Chinese state in creating the Orwellian society in China, where everybody is under surveillance? And different countries are responding in different ways to that. We have taken a rather pragmatic view. The Australians, who are much more worried about China than we are, they see China as a really serious geostrategic threat now, with its activities in the Pacific and its attempts at subverting their own democratic processes at local and national government level, which are well established and proven. So they've simply decided we are going to have nothing to do with Huawei, and not just Huawei, but actually any Chinese company. End. The Americans also have commercial issues at stake, so I'm not surprised, particularly under Donald Trump with his attitude to China as a rival, that they won't do it. My feeling is that the pressure will grow on this government to change their position and not to have Huawei. But I'm certainly not going to say that they have done some enormity by deciding to allow it into our systems. But as I say, the geostrategic issue remains absolutely clear. And I think it's one that we need to continue to debate. And the other thing that we also have to keep in mind is we may have the wherewithal to detect any attempt at creating backdoors into our internet systems, but large numbers of other countries don't. And so one of the other arguments that was certainly being touted around is, if we allow them to do it here, what will actually happen is they'll give the green light to other countries to have Huawei, and they then may well regret it. Your comments about, say, Cobra. We don't, and I should explain, scrutinize Cobra. As an Attorney General, I participated in the National Security Council. Cobra just means Cabinet Office Briefing Room A, no more than that. It is just a place where Cabinet committees meet when they need to meet with a degree of security. That's all there is to it. And so Cobra meetings are set up on an ad hoc basis as a sort of subcommittee dealing normally with security issues in relation to any particular topic. It could be transport, it could be health, as in the case of COVID. Obviously, I'm aware that criticism has been made of the Prime Minister for not turning up to 5 Cobra meetings in relation to COVID. And they may well be well made, those criticisms. On the other hand, I suspect the more important thing was he focusing on it or not? And I think the evidence may suggest that in the early weeks of the threat, he was not. But that's probably more important as to whether he was actually personally present at Cobra meetings or absent from them. Generally speaking, Prime Ministers do often chair Cobra meetings, and certainly would be expected to on any issue which concerns a national security where there is an immediate crisis taking place. So I hope that answers your second half of your question. I'm sorry, I've gone on rather a lot about that. And further questions, welcome.
Yes, I've got a question actually, and quite a few people have raised similar points about electoral reform. Now, you were a popular MP in your constituency and you served there for a long time, and yet, of course, you were not able to beat the Conservative Party candidate in 2019. Do you think when most people go to the polls, they're voting for people, or do you think that perhaps regrettably they're voting ultimately for a party?
I think they're voting ultimately for a party. Of course, there's an influence in both directions, but people's habits and loyalties in this country are fairly tribal. There are swing voters, but the numbers of swing voters are, as you know, quite limited. And as the Liberal Democrats have found, often to their frustration, You can pile up percentage share of the vote under the first past the post system, but it doesn't reflect itself in the outcome when it comes to the number of seats you win. And the most egregious example was the SDLP in 1983. If they had 1 percentage swing more, they would have actually ended up with more MPs than Labour. As it was, Labour was still behind them. I mean, that's the most extraordinary thing. And Labour still won hundreds of seats, whereas they got a very limited number. I've made clear, and I took this view several years ago, so it's not the result of my own personal experience as an MP, that I am in favour of moving away from first past the post system. I'm not sure which the best system is. List systems do not commend themselves to me, but I think there are quite compelling arguments for saying that first past the post is not a functional system, particularly when you end up with a situation where you don't have a two-party system and you have a 2.5-party system, or even a 3-party system, which is where in some parts of the country 4-party we're ending up. I'm afraid nothing's going to happen about that anytime soon, so we have to live with the current system. I certainly can't complain about the outcome in my own constituency. I think it was fairly predictable. As I say, Conservative voters are pretty tribal. I represented a massively Conservative area. In my time as MP, I raised the Conservative vote so that my majority went up from 13 to nearly 26,000. Sorry, 25,000, I think, at the last election in 17. And winning that seat was going to be an uphill task. And to that was added the undoubted problem that people tend to vote in elections on national basis. You found people on the doorstep who'd say, look, Dominic, I want to vote for you, but I don't feel I can because it will help let Jeremy Corbyn into Downing Street. And I was saying, well, you don't have to worry about that. If you elect me and I become a member of Parliament, I'm under no circumstances as an independent going to help Jeremy Corbyn get into Downing Street. But people don't see it that way. We who are involved in politics may see the logic of that argument, but I think for the public it simply isn't there. They see the votes piling up nationally for both political parties and see that as the key determinant of the way they are going to vote. So ending up getting the size of just under 30% of the electorate was probably, in the circumstances, as good as I was ever likely to do. It was a personal vote, some of it with the Liberal Democrats who very kindly supported me. There were some Labour people who couldn't bring themselves to vote for Jeremy Corbyn, and there were quite a few Conservatives who decided that they would support me, but the vast majority of Conservatives didn't. And they were reinforced by people who decided to vote, who were just so appalled by Jeremy Corbyn, who was utterly toxic. I have never come across a more toxic politician in my constituency in all my career. He was a disaster for Labour from start to finish, and the outcome was therefore very predictable.
You've described Boris Johnson as lacking all integrity, that he can't be trusted. Do you think that we have seen some of this perhaps in his handling of the COVID crisis?
Boris Johnson is an extremely engaging individual at one level. He makes people laugh. He's somebody who, if you meet him in a corridor, will usually have a smile and a nice word for people. He can make people feel wanted. And above all, he has a high level of sunny optimism. All that, in my opinion, conceals the fact that he's ultimately a very self-centered individual whose principal interest is Johnson, and he is an immensely ambitious individual. His biography he wrote of Churchill was because he sees Churchill as a hero figure that he would like to emulate. He wants to go down in history as a Churchillian figure. But linked to that is an astonishing unreliability and a propensity for not telling the truth. Indeed, to such an extent that I think that unlike most people who do sometimes tell lies, I think we have to accept that this is something that all of us looking at our lives can see. But most of us feel some degree of shame or guilt when it happens, and he plainly doesn't at all. It just doesn't bother him, indeed to the extent that I think he doesn't even realise that he's doing it. And he has a long track record of this as a journalist, and a long track record of this in politics, and a remarkable propensity for being disloyal. His behaviour when he was Foreign Secretary towards Theresa May was outrageous. I mean, she tolerated it, and I think she was a mistake. It was a mistake on her part. You do have to have a level of collective responsibility. But he wants to be loved. He wants to be in people's affection. I thought it was quite telling when we had Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, watching him alone in the chamber being challenged by Keir Starmer. He looked very uncomfortable. And I think his discomfort was not so much being challenged by Keir Starmer as not being surrounded by the sort of cheering crowd of approving noises, which is what gives him a lift. It's what I call the Tinkerbell factor. It's the fact that, if you say, I believe in fairies, then the light glows. And if you say, I don't, then the light starts to fade. He's very dependent on crowd adulation, and he's very good at getting it. Now, I've been very careful over COVID. It's must not be a party political issue. And I also recognise, and I've made this clear on a number of occasions, that you can have all the faults I've identified with Boris Johnson, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're an incapable politician. On the contrary, as a politician, he's shown remarkable capacities for success, including particularly his selection of people to do the heavy lifting for him when he does the fronting up. But there are some indications that he did not take COVID seriously and was unable to get his head round the seriousness of COVID because it interfered with his own worldview of what he is trying to achieve when he was Prime Minister. This is quite a common phenomenon amongst politicians. You're fixed on a particular goal, which at that time is achieving Brexit with, I suppose the word he would use, éclat, so delivering on his promises, and actually not paying attention to this monster that was growing in the room and giving the impression that it could be batted away quite easily, and therefore he got caught short. And found himself behind the curve. Now, that said, you could argue that the same thing has happened to politicians in most other countries in the world. So I think we've got to be careful. And I don't think the public hold it against him particularly that this has happened. And it may be, of course, that having been so ill and having now recovered, this may be a formative experience and we will get a new and different Boris Johnson. Although at his age, I think it's quite difficult to change one's approach to life. And one of the problems for him, I think, is that if he were to, people might then start looking at him and saying, actually, we don't so much like what we see, because so much of what is attractive are the very things which get him into trouble.
And on the subject of Boris Johnson, do you think he will be the dominant figure in the Conservative Party in the years to come? And related to that, do you think that the Conservative Party will ever go back to being the sort of party which you could potentially be further involved with, which maybe will be a bit more liberal towards Europe and so on?
I think the capacity of the Conservative Party to go back and to be a place where I would find myself comfortable, yes, I'm sure it's there. Indeed, in a funny, ironic, slightly bizarre way, if Brexit goes the way I think it will, unfortunately, which is that it is not a successful enterprise for the United Kingdom, then I think it's almost inevitable that the Conservative Party will move back towards a much more pro-European centre ground of politics, and will do it under the influence of Conservative Party members and Conservative backbench MPs who tend on the whole to be fairly unideological and very pragmatic. It's one of the great strengths of the Conservative Party, has always been its pragmatism. Where does that put Boris Johnson? Hard to know. Some people think that he's quite capable of veering off in a new direction at any time that suits him, and that at some point he might simply ditch his ERG colleagues, perhaps once he's delivered Brexit, and then start being very pro-European again. He keeps on insisting to those Conservative MPs who are more pro-European, trust me, I am resolutely pro-European myself. I know this may sound very odd. Pro-European, but not pro-EU. That's always how he's marketed his position. And indeed, I think there is some evidence that he never wanted Brexit to happen at all. But it suited him to front up the Leave campaign, because what he thought was going to happen was that the Leave campaign would lose, but he would generate the kudos for himself of being the champion of this section of the public, and it would enable him to inherit David Cameron's mantle in 2018, when Cameron announced roughly around 2018 he was going to go, 2018 or 19, and he would then be able, in fact, to conduct a sort of classically conservative, European cynical, but nevertheless engaged policy, and have a quiet life. There's quite a lot of evidence that he doesn't really like hard work.
Obviously, you were heavily involved in the fight against Brexit, specifically in Parliament, and a couple of the other big names would be John Bercow and Joanna Cherry. What do you think the impact will be, sort of constitutionally and with the workings of Parliament of these fights that just gone?
I think it's very difficult to say, particularly because I'm no longer in the House of Commons. But clearly, last year particularly was a rather extraordinary year. You had regularly, once, even sometimes twice a week, groups of members of Parliament meeting on a cross-party basis, including Conservatives, Labour, SNP, Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru, and meeting to discuss how to try to steer the parliamentary debate towards achieving a second referendum. And there was also another group, similarly drawn from all the political parties, although less so from the Liberal Democrats, which was trying to argue that it wanted to prevent a no-deal Brexit and wanted, if anything, to try to achieve a sort of soft Brexit where we stayed in the customs union. And those two groups broadly cooperated also with each other, and indeed there was an overlap between who attended the group meetings. I actually probably went to both most of the time, even though I was a believer in the second referendum. And that's how we achieved what we achieved in September, and how we actually put fetters round Boris Johnson's freedom of operation. But it was hard to maintain that once prorogation had ceased and he had cut a deal with the EU for leaving. And then, of course, as I say, the rug was pulled from under our feet by Jeremy Corbyn's decision that he was going to go for a general election. Talking to my colleagues who are currently in Parliament, including those who attended those meetings are no longer taking place. So they were there for a specific purpose, but my understanding is that's all over. Nevertheless, there is a legacy, I suspect, which will last for a while, which was the awareness that backbenchers can cooperate together to achieve particular ends, and can probably do that quite successfully. Beyond that, I simply don't know. Clearly, there are constitutional issues to Brexit. People worry about Scottish independence. I think that that is a possibility, although I also think that in reality, Nicola Sturgeon has got a very hard task in persuading the Scottish electorate to have the disruption that independence would bring to them. It could only happen, I think, as an emotional response of anger against what has happened. And in an ironic way, and I think we can't escape this, I've said it before, leaving the EU makes Scottish independence in one way rather harder. Northern Ireland is a different matter. And I worry a lot about Northern Ireland, and I worry particularly in the Northern Ireland context because there seems to be some clear signs that Boris Johnson may renege on the Northern Ireland Protocol. which would be, for the United Kingdom, which is a country that believes in the rules-based international system, an astonishing thing to do. You'll also have to find a complacent Attorney General to sign it off, and I shall be interested to see who would be willing to do that. We are clearly in a time of turbulence, but I don't, and it may be that that turbulence leads in the longer term to major constitutional change, but I don't think it's about to happen in the short term. The most significant place in trigger point terms, I think, is Northern Ireland at the moment, but things can change quite quickly. But as for Parliament itself, yes, Parliament realised that backbenchers can have a voice. That was perhaps novel, but of course the circumstances will only come back if we have a hung Parliament where the government has a very small majority, and at the moment that's not the case.
So far, everything you've said, I can't really think of any exceptions, has obviously resonated with us a lot. But one area in which I reckon you might be different is the issue of gay marriage, because in 2013 you described the bill as badly conceived. And I was just interested if your thoughts on this have developed in any way, or if you hold to that original position.
I think I was probably slightly misunderstood, and it's my own, well, I'm not sure it's my own fault. As Attorney General at the time, it wasn't really my ability to, my role to start speaking publicly about this issue. So to explain, I mean, firstly, in one sense, I am not against gay marriage. There were, however, some absurdities about the legislation. And the reason why I abstained, I never opposed it, was because what I'd said to David Cameron at the time was that my opinion was that what he was trying to do would be much better met by abolishing civil marriage completely and replacing it with civil partnership open to people of the opposite sex and to people of the same sex. And just to explain why, civil marriage is a strange spin-off which dates from the late 1830s. Prior to that, the only place you could get married was in an Anglican church. And you had a very strange situation where Jews would have to zip off to St. George's, Hanover Square, where the rector, with no questions asked, would marry them in accordance with the rites of the Church of England so that they got marriage status. And as a consequence, when we created civil marriage in the registry office, it has all sorts of religious bits, or I think, attached to it. For example, you can get a decree of nullity on the basis of non-consummation. So the state is rather intrusive into what goes on in the bedroom. And when we came to look at gay marriage, the same-sex marriage, which I do understand exactly why David Cameron wanted to bring it in, we had to start grappling with these issues. And in fact, same-sex marriage is significantly different as a matter of law from marriage, civil marriage between parties of the opposite sex. So we don't have, in a curious way, complete equality. And that was why I argued that it was better to have civil partnership, because that then freed people up. They could go and get married wherever they liked. They could get married in a church. If the church doesn't wish to recognise same-sex marriage, there are some religious groups, Christian, liberal, Jewish, who do recognise same-sex marriage, so you can go and get married there. And actually what you would get from the civil partnership was the financial, the next of kin, the legal recognition, and the financial advantages that go with marriage. I discussed this with my wife and I said, why are we married? Are we married because we have a marriage certificate or because we took vows to each other in church? The answer for us is because we made promises to each other in a church. The certificate is merely a state stamp explaining that as a result, our lives have changed in a number of significant ways. And it made it much easier to introduce completely the concept of no-fault divorce, because ultimately, if you have a civil partnership, it's a determinable contract and it applies to everybody in civil terms. The question as to how you treat it morally in terms of your religious beliefs is a matter for you. That's why I abstained on same-sex marriage. But it's happened. And I've been to several same-sex marriages since, of friends. I am totally untroubled by it, and it's now happened. The government did end up being mildly hoist on its own petard because, of course, as you'll be aware, there's been a case in the Supreme Court which, not to my surprise, said there had to be civil partnership for members of the opposite sex. Had I been listened to when this bill came in, we might have avoided that. But I do realise that for David Cameron, the expression marriage and being able to give that to people of the same sex mattered a lot. And I have no doubt at all that the word mattered a lot to them as well. And that's why he went down that road.
Maybe slightly more revolutionary. People are currently talking in our chat about that none of this would actually be a problem if the Church of England were actually disestablished. Do you think that there is any realistic chance, or do you think it would at all be a good thing to see any major constitutional changes like the disestablishment of the church or changes to the monarchy?
I don't think the disestablishment of the Church of England would make any difference to this whatsoever. I'm not in favour of disestablishment because I happen to think that the injection of a level of Christian principle into the way our state works is, let's put it this way, I always see from it some advantages, and nobody has yet succeeded in persuading me that there are any significant drawbacks. I don't know how many of you have read Tom Holland's Dominion, but I strongly recommend Tom Holland's Dominion. It's a superb book, and it absolutely illustrates that whatever else you may believe, you could be an atheist in this country, but the philosophical underpinnings under which Western society operates are in fact derived from our Christian past, even if people don't believe in the supernatural aspects of Christianity. So I think it's, let's put it this way, innocuous. And I think if you were to disestablish the Church of England, it would make no difference. Obviously, any church, churches are grappling with the issue of same-sex marriage. It's clearly very unlikely that the Roman Catholic Church is ever going to accept the notion of same-sex marriage. The Anglican Church certainly accepts the notion that we have vicars who are living in civil partnership with other vicars. I meet them regularly as I'm a practicing member of the Church of England, and nobody bats an eyelid about it. But equally, there's a belief that marriage is the monogamous relationship between two people of the opposite sex, because that's what the Church's teaching is, and it's pretty well enshrined in history and canon law. Now, there are some religious sects, groups which are Christian, and undoubtedly Christian, which don't take that view. If the Church of England is disestablished, it might go along that road. Equally, it might not. And actually, if it stays established, in my judgment, there's very little to prevent it deciding that it wishes to endorse same-sex marriage if it wanted to, although that would then create a massive fissure with the rest of the Anglican communion in Africa, who are absolutely resolutely against it. Those are the issues which are preventing the Church of England from doing it. And there will be some Anglican communions which will doubtless move towards it. Indeed, the Anglican communion itself may fragment over it. That's my view on Church of England disestablishment. On constitutional reform more generally, I used to give lots of lectures about this and highlight that there were good arguments for considering some measure of constitutional reform. And I haven't changed my view on that, but I have to say to you, I think it's a slightly sterile argument because I don't think it's happening anytime soon, either in terms of our electoral system or in terms of the House of Lords. I certainly think the House of Lords is ripe for reform. I don't happen to believe in an elected second chamber because I don't see who the people are who are going to stand for election. But there is an argument that it should be a much slimmed down chamber of only about 300 people. It could be called a Senate. You might have some form of election and appointment to it, but as I say, I think it's most unlikely that anybody will do anything with it. And it's wrong to say that the House of Lords isn't functioning properly. Actually, it functions very well. It's just that about half, if not rather more than half of its membership don't actually play a meaningful role in its work at all. And the group who do a very good job.
We have a question from Joshin, who asks whether the Lib Dems should include a pledge to rejoin the EU and whether there might in the future be an appetite for that.
Well, it's a matter for you. I would be a little bit hesitant myself at this stage about doing that. I think that we've got to be careful. One of the difficulties right through the post-Brexit period, when I was arguing for a second referendum, of course, I hoped a second referendum might lead to people saying we changed our mind before we took the difficult, not irrevocable, but nevertheless, a long-term step of leaving. But the danger is always that one's seen as being poor losers. And I also thought, I should explain this, that I thought that if the second referendum actually reinforced the decision of the first, which was always a possibility, then people would actually find it easier to come together afterwards when that confirmation had taken place. So I saw value in having it. But we're gone now. I certainly harbour a long-term desire to see us back in close partnership with our European partners. I'm not sure it will necessarily take the form of rejoining the EU in its current form. It may well be in any case by then that the EU will have evolved into a rather different organisation. It's got some very considerable challenges at the moment, but the ideal behind it and the worth behind it, I've never had any doubt about at all. It's an imperfect organisation, but you're never going to get a perfect organisation. But it brings parties together. It reduces the risk of violent conflict. It contributes to a wider social good and the improvement and quality of life and security of all our citizens from cradle to grave. And it was a really valuable institution. If I were in your position, I'd hold fire and simply say, we want a very close relationship and let time evolve. Because my judgment is that as time goes by, our arguments over this will become more compelling and harder to ignore. So it's a question of when you decide you want to say it.
The Foreign Secretary has been a vocal critic of the European Convention on Human Rights, and I was wondering if you could comment on where you see the UK going as a member of the Council of Europe and as signatory to the Convention itself.
Well, I've done a long history of this, and of course it's probably what brought my political career, well, not to an end, but it certainly took it on its downturn, because it's what led David Cameron to sack me, because I was against his desire to put in the Conservative manifesto of 2016, which is what he did, this statement that we were going to scrap the Human Rights Act, replace it with a British Bill of Rights, that it might well no longer be compliant with our obligations under the ECHR, in which case we would tell the European Court of Human Rights that they could get lost. That was essentially what he was arguing. And I said, this is a very bad idea. It remains a very bad idea. And the extraordinary part about it is that we are now 10, 12, 13, 14 years since the Conservative Party first got sort of fixated on this issue. But we're still members of the Council of Europe. We're still adherent to the European Convention on Human Rights. We still have the Human Rights Act. And interestingly, there's less current gripe about this than there has been for quite a long time. One of the reasons being that Ken Clarke and I got the Brighton Declaration in 2012, which proved to be, 2012 or 2013, I think it's 20, which proved to be a turning point for the way the court functioned. So of course, like any international treaty organization, it's not perfect, but its overall beneficial impact is massive, particularly on the behavior in some of the more recent democracies of Eastern Europe, where authoritarian tendencies still subsist. It's the creation of the UK. It's a massive piece of soft power for which we're recognized. Now, I don't know, the latest Conservative manifesto has got the same old stuff trotted out all over again. And as I know Dominic Grieve very well. He used to be my chief of staff when I was Shadow Home Secretary 10 years ago. I'm perfectly well aware that he too has a degree of fixation about this and a vast criticism of the way the ECHR functions. But what every civil servant, every ambassador will say to him is, Foreign Secretary, if we start jeopardizing our role in the Council of Europe when we're leaving the EU, it is the last serious major European forum in which we have always been seen as being a leading light, and we are going to lose all the clout and influence that goes with it. And I can't see the point. There will be no benefits to us of any kind whatsoever for doing this. So I do worry about it, but in a funny way, after 14 years of seeing this repetitive obsession beset a section of my party, I've also become fairly confident that it's probably going nowhere.
I don't want to keep you too long, but we've got a couple of maybe slightly shorter quick-fire questions.
Right, try and do those before I stop.
Not that they're necessarily that easy to answer in quickfire, but the first is, do we need more QCs in the Commons? The second is, what do you think about the balance of civil liberties with regard to sort of the current COVID crisis and perhaps privacy with this new NHS app and things like that? And then the third is maybe more fun, is how have you been keeping yourself busy in lockdown? Have you got any new lockdown hobbies?
Right. Do we need more QCs in the Commons? There was a period 15 years ago when a number of practicing lawyers, that is lawyers, there's always been a lot of people who've had some legal experience, but people who were current practitioners or just ceased practice on election started to get very small. And I must say, we've never gone back up to the sort of levels we had in the 50s and 60s. And I think that we could benefit from having some more QCs in the Commons. But it's harder and harder to reconcile a top career at the bar with going into Parliament. Ultimately, if you go into Parliament, as Geoffrey Cox has found, you're going to lose a lot of money if you want to be an active player. And he's now no longer an active player, so Geoffrey could go back and as he ceased to be attorney. But it's unusual to be able to combine the two successfully, although he is probably the only example of somebody who did, although initially that was probably at the expense of his career as a politician. So I think we could have more, but I'm actually happier about the situation. Well, I'm not sure. I think post this election, it may well be that there is a lack of them. But in the period between 2005 and 2017, there were actually quite a lot of us in the Commons on all the benches. Labour is the party where I think the lack of it is most notable, but as now they've got a really distinguished QC as the leader of their party, it's a less serious problem. The Conservative Party is massively underrepresented in the House of Lords with lawyers, and that's been a long-standing problem which has got much worse. You, as the Liberal Democrats, have got far more actually quite distinguished lawyers in the Lords than we have. It's a very curious fact. Civil liberties. Well, you have to be vigilant. The British state is not an authoritarian construct, but it can creep into authoritarianism under pressure, and you have to keep a watch on what it's doing. And yes, of course, the COVID legislation is a massive intrusion into civil liberties, which was why I was very pleased when the House of Commons made clear that it wanted a review clause, not 2 years, but 6 months. And they were absolutely right to do that. And I'm fairly confident that when the COVID crisis is over, it will go. And you saw the consequences of it. Like, on the whole, I think the management of COVID in terms of restriction on what people can do has worked extremely well, and in fact has been done almost entirely voluntarily. But there were some police who behaved ludicrously in there towards citizens, which just shows what happens when you give people power and you don't control it. I mean, some of the things were just stupid and showed a lack of understanding of how human beings conduct their relationships. I was astonished about drones flying over the Derbyshire moors and putting stain into lakes in order to make it a less breath. It's just absurd, completely over the top. But that's always what happens. So despite my concerns and my hope that we get rid of this legislation as quickly as possible, my own experience of government and my own experience of being chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee is that we don't live in a state, and I say this of any government, which is trying to undermine civil liberties and destroy them. When it does happen, it usually happens because the government is frightened or on the back foot. We saw that with the 40-day and 90-day pre-charge detention, which I look back on with fond memories, because that was the last time there was a great coming together of backbenchers of all parties, and the first time that Tony Blair, as you may recall, before your time, was defeated. And I was heavily involved in that in 2005. And to your last question, what have I been up to? Well, apart from doing webinars on Zoom and talking to people, I've been getting rid of 22 years of accumulated junk. I go running twice a week. I cycle around distributing leaflets to various and messages to various people who, amazingly, in our church, who are not on the internet. And I've taken up to playing chess again with one of my sons, who is locked down with us. He's a graduate and he's looking for work, and it's not the best time at the moment to be doing that. And I have another son who I say is in the army and was just trying to ring me up earlier, and occasionally makes contact from Kabul, where he is. And I am reading more than I would usually do. And as I say, I'm also, my wife would say that I'm reconnecting with her after 22 years of absence. So none of those things are necessarily bad. My biggest regret is that I should be leaving for Scotland this week and go walking in the Highlands. And that is unfortunately impossible, which I do view with considerable regret.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion. And I hope to be able to invite you to Cambridge sometime soon in person.
I would be delighted, and thank you all very much for giving up of your time. And it's been a great pleasure to have the conversation. Thank you.